It's recording now.
Okay, great. So I'll just give a quick outline as to what we're going to cover this afternoon. We're going to do a quick introduction, and then the main bulk of the workshop this afternoon is going to be split into two sessions of presentations. The first session is going to involve three presentations focused on research conducted on evidence from the UK, which are research projects that we've been conducting as part of our Survey Futures project on video interviewing. And then the second session of presentations is going to involve a couple of presentations from international colleagues. And then we'll conclude with a discussion, which we hope everyone can be involved in, about the future prospects of video interviewing. So just to say a few words about our project and to give a bit of context, use of video interviewing as a mode to conduct social surveys is relatively new, but use of the mode accelerated significantly during the pandemic. So for example, at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, we pivoted to the use of video interviewing in two of the major cohort studies that we run. But because the mode is so new, when we set out on this project in 2023, there was very little evidence about the effectiveness of the mode or the impact on measurement, and little guidance also about how best to collect survey data by video. So the broad aims of our project were to look into this and assess the merits of video interviewing as a mode for conducting social surveys, and to explore whether the mode has a future post-pandemic, and if so, how best to optimally conduct interviews by video to maximize the quality of the data collected. Just a few words about the project team. So this is a research strand which is part of the wider Survey Futures programme. The strand leads are myself, Tim Hansen from City University, and Gabby Durant from Southampton. Over the course of the project, there have been three researchers that have been working with us. Sebastian Kochar, who's now based at the University of Queensland, Mark Asensio, who's now based at the University of Lausanne, and Helena Kerber, who's still with us at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies at UCL. And you're going to be hearing from Mark and Helena this afternoon. And we've also been fortunate to have input from many other colleagues, including my colleague Carol from UCL, Karina from GSIS, and Martin and Sam from NatSen in particular. So I'm just going to hand over to Gabby briefly to say a few words about some of the project outputs which we're not going to be presenting today, and then we'll get stuck into the presentations. So over to you, Gabby.
Thank you very much, Matt. I'll just briefly alert you to the first working paper that we produced as part of the project. And this was getting together evidence from across 7 major UK surveys, in particular focusing on the uptake, response issues, the characteristics of respondents that respond via video interviewing, and generally looking at the feasibility of collecting more complex survey measures, for example, sensitivity measures or consent to data linkage and so on. And there are a number of key findings, all of which are available in the working paper, and we will very shortly put all the links to the working papers into the chat, so people will have that, so you don't have to squeeze that out from the slides. So key findings from this first working paper that was sort of the base for all the other working papers where we are giving presentations in more detail today, was first of all that video first mode led to somewhat lower response rates than face-to-face, and that's probably expected because of, for example, you have to make appointments and things like that. But otherwise, we actually found really high quality of the resulting survey data, and really comparable also to face-to-face interviewing, which was very encouraging. There were also lower levels of uptake when it was used as a sort of alternative mode in a mixed mode design offer. Generally, we found, or we concluded, that there is some potential in this method or in this mode, when it is used in the complementary mode, in a mixed mode survey design setup, and it is offering sort of more cost-efficient fieldwork processes, of course, and this is in particular the case for longitudinal surveys. This first working paper with the results and the summary and so on will be forthcoming this year shortly in the MDA special issue on video interviewing. And yeah, we just wanted to highlight that because a number of these papers are on video interviewing are coming out in this special issue. And then I just wanted to highlight as well that one key output from the research strand on survey futures on video interviewing was also a survey practice guide, and that is also available on our website. Again, I'll put the link into the chat in a minute. And that really summarizes the sort of key survey practice aspects of video interviewing. And the lead authors here are Matt and Tim in particular, and also Mark as well. And that really sort of summarizes our experiences and our results from a sort of survey practice perspective. And I now would like to hand over to Matt, since we are now going to look at the different results and the different presentations for today's workshop. First of all, looking at the international UK perspective, and first of all, looking at the UK perspective, and then at the sort of international perspective.
Great, thank you, Gabby. Just switching my slides. Okay, and just the other thing that I'd meant to say during my introduction was that after each talk, there's going to be just a small amount of time for some questions and discussion. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand during the discussion section. Either is fine. So I'm going to start off this afternoon by presenting some findings on measurement mode effects using evidence from the BCS-70 study. So the BCS-70 study being the 1970 British cohort study. Well, we've already said this. Live video interviewing, as we've discussed, expanded rapidly during the pandemic. But we know very little, really, about the impact of video interviewing on how people answer survey questions. So we know there's much evidence that mode of data collection can affect the way in which people respond to our survey questions. There's lots of evidence suggesting that there are mode measurement differences between some of the more commonly used modes like web, telephone, face-to-face, etc. What evidence there is so far does suggest that data collected by video may be more comparable with data collected in person than data collected via web, but the evidence is limited. So the key question of this research that we're focusing on here is, do responses differ between video and in-person interviews? So as I said, I'm going to be using data from the 1970 British cohort study, and specifically from our age 51 survey, which was conducted between 2021 and 2024. We achieved around 7,300 interviews as part of that sweep, and those were split fairly equally between video interviews and in-person interviews. And what happened was our fieldwork was conducted in waves. The early waves that were conducted during the pandemic when in-person interviewing wasn't feasible were conducted initially video only. So participants were asked to participate via video, and there was no other option to them available at that time. When in-person interviewing became feasible again, we went back to those people who had not taken part during this video only phase and offered them the opportunity to take part face-to-face. Then, when in-person interviewing became feasible again, we switched back to our usual approach of primarily inviting people to take part in person, but we retained the video option for those that would prefer to take part in that way. And just to note that the survey itself covered a whole range of different domains, and the setup in this way gives us a kind of quasi-experimental design with which we can look at the impact of mode on measurement. The allocation to these two stages was not fully at random, but it was largely randomized, and I'll come on to say a bit more about that in a moment. In terms of response rates, in the case of BCS 70, actually, there was no difference in the overall response rate between those that were initially invited to take part via video and then followed up face-to-face, and those that were initially, from the outset, invited to take part in person. So a 60% response rate in both of those groups. In the video first group, we achieved a 46% response rate via video, and then boosted the response rate by a further 14% when we invited non-respondents to take part in person. But you can see that when we invited people to take part in person with video as an alternative option, the proportion of interviews that were achieved via video was really very small. Just 1% of our total response rate was via video. So I mentioned that allocation to the waves and therefore mode was not fully randomized. However, those that were allocated to video first approach and the in-person first approach were very similar in terms of composition. So there were no differences in sex, education, employment, partnership status, ethnicity, or prior levels of participation in the study. But there were very significant differences in terms of participation via mode. And so in particular, the groups that we found who were more likely to complete via video were women, those that were better educated, homeowners, those in better health, those with a partner, and also people who had participated in the previous wave of BCS 70. So as a result of the fact that the video participants and the in-person participants differed in many ways, we had to adjust for this in order to explore the impact of mode on measurement. And so to address for selection effects, we used propensity score weighting. We used 34 confounders, which had been measured earlier in life, right the way from birth through to age 46, using multiple imputation to impute where any of these characteristics were missing. And we selected the confounders on the basis that they'd previously shown to predict survey participation in the study or key substantive outcomes. And so the goal of this approach was to attempt to isolate measurement differences from selection effects. So we focused our analysis on 103 survey variables from the age 51 survey, and these variables were selected on the basis that they're variables that are widely used by researchers using BCS 70 data, or they are items that we thought, based on theory, would be potentially susceptible to measurement mode effects, so potentially prone to social desirability, satisficing answer order effects, etc. And the measures that we selected for inclusion in our analysis covered the full range of domains which are covered in BCS 70. And so we conducted regression analysis on each of the variables of interest using survey mode as the key explanatory variable. And we ran these models before and after applying propensity score weights. We used a variety of different regression models depending on the outcome we were looking at, so logistic, linear models, and a variety of other models too. And essentially, the idea was that differences that we found in the unadjusted models would largely be explained by differences in sample composition across participants taking part in the two modes, but any differences that remained after propensity score weighting adjustment would potentially indicate the existence of measurement mode effects. So at an overall level, we found many differences between the modes when we were looking at the unadjusted models, which was as expected, and we suspect largely reflects differences in the composition of those taking part in the two modes. But after applying propensity score weighting adjustment, the level of magnitude of differences was reduced significantly. And So our initial interpretation of this was that most observed differences reflected selection into mode rather than measurement effects. And just to dive into that in a bit more detail by domain. So when we were looking at variables in the household composition, housing and education domains, we found very little evidence of measurement mode effects after adjustment. In the sphere of employment, we found very few differences again, but there were a few differences. In particular, we noted that video respondents were more likely to report higher levels of work stress and lower job security, suggesting greater willingness to disclose negative work experiences. And in the domain of social capital and well-being, video respondents were more positive about their life satisfaction and trust in others, reflecting perhaps greater candor in virtual interviews. Sorry, I said that wrong. Video respondents reported lower levels of life satisfaction and trust in others, indicating greater candor in virtual interviews. But we didn't find any differences in terms of mental health or loneliness. In the domain of finances, there were a few differences. Video respondents did report more sources of income and were more likely to tell us about their pensions. But when we looked at total level of income reported and savings, there were no differences. PCS 17 includes a range of cognitive tests. There were 4 tests included. Video respondents performed better in all 4 of those tests, which we think potentially might result from there being less pressure in the virtual environment, but also there were some differences in the administration context. And it is not out of the question that people taking part with a video interviewer might have been able to cheat in some way. When we looked at political attitudes, we found that video respondents were more likely to express more conservative views, so as measured by their voting in the last general election and their attitudes towards Brexit. And in the sphere of health and healthy behaviours, video respondents reported better health and healthier behaviours. So this kind of ran counter to what we might have expected based on the other findings of greater candour in the virtual setting. But we suspect that this is likely to reflect residual differences in sample composition. There were less confounders related to the sphere of health than there were to other domains. So that's our hunch there. So in conclusion, we did find many differences between video and in-person responses when we were looking at the unadjusted comparisons. But when we adjusted to try to isolate measurement effects from selection effects, we found that the differences were reduced substantially. So our key takeaway is that most of the observed differences did reflect selection into survey mode rather than measurement mode effects. But there were some remaining differences, which, as I've just said, were concentrated in the political attitudes, cognition, and aspects of social capital and well-being. So broadly speaking, our conclusion would be that from a measurement perspective, at least, video interviewing appears to be broadly comparable with in-person interviewing, and as such, a viable option for inclusion in mixed mode designs. Stop sharing now.
Right.
So, any questions?
So yeah, if anyone has questions, either raise your hand or type them into the chat. There's a couple kind of quick ones, Matt, which I think Gabby's responded to, but maybe you could quickly.
Okay.
So yeah, it's just confirming it was mode self-selection and what was the recruitment method.
So in terms of recruitment, yeah, so these are participants in an ongoing longitudinal study. So we have extensive contact details for the vast majority of participants. And so recruitment into the video interviews was conducted remotely via telephone and email. In the video first waves, as I explained, hopefully, the participants were initially invited to take part via video, and at that point, that was the only mode that was available to take part in. Although it was explained that when feasible, if they would prefer not to take part in video, it would be possible for them to take part in person. When we were recruiting the participants in the later waves, which were primarily conducted in person, in-person interviewing was prioritized, but it was made clear that if people preferred, they could tell their interviewer they'd rather take part via video. But so yes, so participants could self-select into mode.
Okay, great. There's one more. Would you say video interviewing is a viable method for mixed mode design? Also, if not so good data for PSW? Intuitively, I would say yes. PSW, should that be pushed? Do you mean push to web, Michelle, or is it something else? Oh, sorry, propensity score weighting, right?
Right, okay. Well, so yeah, I mean, in terms of the overall conclusion would be that once we used propensity score weighting to adjust for the differential composition of the participants participating in each of the two modes, the mode effects that remained were on the whole quite minimal and restricted to a few domains, which led us to conclude that yes, it would appear to be a viable mode from a measurement perspective, at least, to include in a mixed mode design. And also, I guess important to say that where differences did remain, in general, it was the video interviewing responses that seem to have greater candor. So perhaps indicating that that those responses, the video responses, were potentially had higher levels of data quality than the equivalent variables from the face-to-face interviews.
Great. And yeah, one more. You said that video interview respondents had better scores in the competence measurements, but were they also more likely to participate in the measurement than in in-person interviews?
No. The level of participation in the cognitive assessments. Well, there were 4 cognitive assessments. One of the assessments was administered somewhat differently via video than it was in the in-person interviews, and required us to send a paper document to participants, which they then, after the interview, had to return to us. Inevitably, as a result of that, we had a lower level of participation in that one cognitive assessment, but the level of participation in the other 3 assessments did not differ across the modes.
Great. And maybe just last one was, were some respondents recruited for the first time and others participated before? And then the comment is, I imagine response rates are much higher for video interviewing for repeating respondents. Is that right?
So in the context of this study, this is a long-running longitudinal cohort study which has been following participants for a very long time, so since 1970. So these are participants that have been involved in the study for decades now. So there were no participants who were recruited at this stage for the first time. Yes, I suspect that you're very right that video interviewing is likely to be a more effective tool for implementation in a study such as this than a study where participants are being recruited for the first time.
Yeah, I think we found that elsewhere, haven't we? So maybe that'll come up in the discussion later. All right, well, thanks a lot, Matt. We'll move on. Lots of other presentations to get through, but thanks very much for that. Our next presenter is Mark Asensio Manhon, and is presenting on assessing the impact of video interviewing on measurement quality evidence from an experimental study on mode effects. So great, I see, Mark, you're sharing your screen.
Yeah, can you see it?
Yeah, you just need to put it in presenter
yes.
mode.
Okay, yeah. All good. Is it fine?
Yeah, all good. Thanks.
Okay, so, well, there's not much time, so this has been introduced already. Hi, I'm Mark. Acknowledgements, the data used in the present study comes from the Center for Longitudinal Studies, and it has been funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council, and this study has been conducted as part of the Survey Futures program. Context not required because Matt has mostly said all this. What I want to say is, because of how video interview was introduced, we didn't know much on how it would affect a lot of aspects of actually the data collection. And we know that mode is one of the elements that defines a lot from whom we're going to collect and how we are going to collect these measures. So now this song starts to get a little bit old, but there was not much research. Now we have more and more, and that's good. But to the point of the moment we started doing this study, there was there was no much research, and the few research that existed could be divided in two. So we had some non-experimental evidence that came from the natural flow of how these video interviews were implemented. And from this, for instance, from the analysis from the European Social Survey round 10, and these studies more or less evidence that differences between in-person and video interviews were minor or non-existent. Now, of course, this is a very quick summary, and it doesn't make justice to the level of detail that these studies have. On the other hand, we had some experimental evidence comparing the modes, video interview and face-to-face or in-person. And these studies also found a high degree of similarity between these two interview-administered modes. So the big question here being, that seems pretty solid. It goes a little bit with what one would logically think. So what are we saying with our study? So our contribution comes from the fact that despite this consistent evidence, the existing research has been limited by some factors. So one, because it's non-experimental, and this can be problematic, as Matt said, for disentangling these self-selection effects. And second, some of this research that is experimental has been conducted in lab control settings with a student sample coming from research pools and similar. So we have that we cannot disentangle self-selection effects. We have a lack of external validity in some, and then no study has compared web face-to-face to video. So if we had to define video interview with all its virtues, we could say that video interview can also mirror some characteristics from the web mode. Therefore, it is important to also see how close it can resemble to this mode. So what we are doing is contributing to the current research by conducting a large-scale real-world setting study experimentally comparing web and in-person interview to video interview. Now, of course, there are some caveats that I'm going to explain later, especially the sample. Big research question being, is data collected by video interview more comparable with data collected in person or by web? How do we answer this question? So the data we are using comes from the measurement lab mode experiment. And importantly, the aim of the experiment was to explore the impact of mode on some of the key measures included in the most recent sweeps of the Next Steps Age 32 survey and the Millennium Cohort study. So most of the questions that we use for the questionnaire in this mode experiment come from the questionnaires in these surveys. And of course, because the aim was about the comparability, we had to recruit a sample that was similar to the ones currently had the mentioned surveys. But for doing so, we recruited a new sample rather than using the respondents from these surveys. So 1,692 participants aged 20 to 40 were recruited in England, and soft quotas on age, gender, and region were applied to ensure this a broadly representative sample. So of course, we're using a non-probability based sample of people aged 20 to 40, which is, we could say, the main drawback. And for this reason, we are not covering one of the gaps in literature, which is the lack of external validity, because we cannot generalize to the whole population. There was a mode allocation using a rotation plan, and the order of allocation randomized between the sample points. So basically, there were 200 sample points across England, and depending on the sample point, there was a different order of allocation. So this is the result. We randomized these people in the 3 modes. Now, the questionnaire, the content was a little bit was a varied content of items. We had questions on household relationship, housing, activities and employment, finances, health, and identity. And the questionnaires also had a more self-completion part, which included more sensitive items like financial literacy, life satisfaction, mental well-being, drinking and smoking behavior, and childhood circumstances. And there was also a cognitive assessment test that is not evaluated in this research, but we do so elsewhere. Now, we compare the 3 modes: web, video interview, in person. We compare them using 2 indicators: item non-response and differences in response distribution. For doing so, we mainly use a regression-based approach, using mode as the main independent variable and controlling for a series of social-demographic characteristics that we had from the respondents. So basically, we're analyzing all items in the questionnaire, but those related to the cognitive assessment test and the social demographic, which of course, because we are using as controls. Now, super important, because then this is going to be related with the results we have. How did we handle non-response? So the aim was to have a comparable non-response approach to non-response, right? For web standard practice, we basically had a skip button available. So you see the question in your screen, are you happy? Yes, no. Now, if you hit the next, like the arrow, right, saying next question, you would then be prompted with, you don't know the answer or you refuse to answer. And this is how non-response was recorded for the web. For in-person, the intention was the same, right? We are discouraging non-response by not explicitly giving these answer categories. So spontaneous non-response was recorded, but not proposed. And for video, it was a mix. Respondents could see the web interface. That's important because it's how the video interview basically was conducted. So the same way you see me on camera and you see my presentation, respondents were seeing the interviewer, and they were also seeing the questionnaire and the questions and the responses. So the interviewer read aloud the answer categories, and if the respondent didn't respond, the refusal or the I don't know could be recorded. Now, importantly, the self-completion module also worked in the same way but different. So of course, web discontinued as another module, and differences couldn't be told. Simply by the fact that the questions were a little bit more intimate, so to speak. For in-person, the interviewer gave a tablet to the respondent, and the respondent continued the questionnaire in that tablet. But important, the interviewer stayed on the room with the respondent. For video, again, the same intention. There was a link that was provided to the respondent, and by clicking it, the respondent could open this self-completion module in their device. Important, the interviewer stayed on the call and the camera was on. Now, for item non-response, for each variable, we created a binary variable determining if the respondent provided or not an answer. We first present the results for separately the results for the self-completion module that from the main regular questionnaire. In general, and that's a good thing, item non-response was really low. Therefore, many variables were fully observed or had too few missing items as for being modeled in this analysis. So as you can see now, let me put okay. So for the main part of the questionnaire, only 3 items had enough missing observations as for us to being able to model them. Now, I'm going to simply quickly explain the figure because they are all going to look the same. Basically, the blue coefficient is the coefficient comparing web to video interview, and the red in-person face-to-face to video interview. So as I was saying, non-response was really rare. Only for these three items, non-response was something that we could actually observe. But these happen to be more common in person than video. So in respondents in in-person interview face-to-face were more likely to give a non-response answer. For the self-completion module, of course, we observed more non-response, as it is to be expected. Despite this, no differences between modes were observed, but for here, the press, where face-to-face respondents were more likely to respond, actually. I had an arrow. Yeah, sure. I forgot about that. The total, now we pull basically all the responses together. So basically we did so for the main part of the questionnaire, the self-completion module, and we pulled everything together, total. As we can see, it was more likely for respondents in the in-person interview to produce non-response. Actually, if we go to the total, we will see better. However, and this is important, these differences are really, really minor. So on average, we had 1.74 item non-response in the face-to-face mode and 140 for video. So are those differences statistically significant from 0? Yes. Will this matter in a real world, like for us? Is it going to be something important? It seems no. But of course, every survey practitioner should judge how important is this for their survey. So for response distribution, the second part of the analysis, we are comparing the response distribution for each variable. So basically, if the responses are different, right? Are people reporting a lower level of mental well-being when they are assigned to the web mode? Again, regression-based approach. We transform most of the variables to be binary. So in most of the variables, we use a logistic instrument for getting these coefficients. And as before, we present the self-completion modules separately. So for the main part of the questionnaire, we observe more differences between web and video interview. Especially we can see it in these three first variables that could be labeled as a little bit sensitive. Basically, those were asking, I feel safe in general with my life. I have someone to trust and I have someone close. For these variables, web respondents were less likely to say, yeah, I feel safe. Yeah, I have someone to trust. Yeah, I have someone close, which could be an indicator of social desirability in the interview-administered modes. Also for health, web respondents were reporting lower levels of health. Now, for the self-completion modules, we observe more differences again for the web video interview comparison, especially with items related to mental well-being. So web respondents were more likely to be worried, were more likely to have little pleasure in the life lately, and also lower levels of life satisfaction. What is also important from this figure is the financial literacy test that we had. So 3 questions asking a factual question, is this correct or not? More or less. It was a question of, well, having to do a little calculation. And we see that web respondents were more likely to give the correct answer for number 1 and number 3. Now, what does all this mean? So video interviews show lower item non-response than in person. And well, this is important because we see that, but also it's almost so little that maybe it's not a real concern, right? Few response differences between interview-administered modes, but significant mode effects between web and video interview, especially on sensitive items, which this hints at classical social desirability bias in front of an interviewer, right? And we see this even in the self-completion model, which was aimed to mitigate these bias effects. And finally, web respondents perform better on the financial literacy test, which it's kind of suggests for us at least that there was some external aid. Either they use the calculator of their phone or they went to internet to get the answer. Going forward, and this a little bit is in line with the conclusions that Matt shared from the previous paper that was presented, video interviewing could complement or replace in-person interviews with minimal impact on measurement. Now, measurement considering the aspects we analyze. There are other aspects from measurement that deserve attention, but non-response and response distribution are kind of two important ones. That being said, this doesn't mean that there are no other challenges associated with the video interview, which could be how to recruit a sample or who is going to participate on video interview. And of course, here we have a sample of 20 to 40. This was not part of the original intention of the paper, but we kind of demonstrated that self-completion models are not fully effective at mitigating social desirability bias. But the good thing is that because of how video interview can be designed, we can choose some other design adaptations that could maybe work in a different way. Now, for instance, we're suggesting maybe turning the camera off or terminating the call to give more privacy to the respondent. However, the interviewer presence is of benefit for other aspects. So when it came to the financial literacy test, we observed that having the interviewer there was positive for reducing the amount of measurement error that was introduced in those questions. And finally, future research should test on a broader range of measures, other designs and populations, especially where uptake is variable. Thank you so much. I think the working paper has been circulated. Hopefully this is going to be published soon, and you can write me at this email. Any questions?
Thank you, Mark. So yeah, if people have questions, tell them to the chat. We don't have very long, so we might only be able to take one and then move on, but we'll potentially have more time for the discussion at the end. So yeah, we'll just wait a moment to see if any questions come in. You can stop sharing actually, Mark.
Yeah, I'm on it.
Yeah, great, thank you.
It's here. Yeah, got it.
Okay, nothing has come in so far. So okay, one has just come in. As I said, nothing has come in. So yes, thanks for the presentation. I understand the effect of social desirability. I was wondering whether participants in the video interviews had the option to turn off their cameras, and if so, whether you still observed effects in that direction.
That's a very interesting question that actually I don't know if, I think they were asked to keep.
I can answer that question,
Yeah,
Mark.
sure.
Well, not massively usefully, but I can say, so participants did have the option to turn their cameras off if they chose to. We don't actually have data on whether they did or not, so we're not able to exploit that opportunity to look at whether that had an impact on how they responded. But my strong sense is that in the main, the cameras were on for participants.
Great, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Mark. We'll move on. So our next presenter is Helena Kerber, and yeah, this is in the evidence from the UK section of the workshop, but you know there is some evidence from the UK here, but it's also goes cross national and covers lots of other countries as well. So yeah, Helena's going to present on video interviewing in the European Social Survey, a post-pandemic view.
Perfect, thank you so much. Can you see my slides okay?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect. Hi, I'm Helena. I'm a research assistant at the Center for Longitudinal Studies, and I work on the Survey Futures project, as Matt also introduced me as. And yes, this work today is in collaboration with Tim Hansen and Matt Brown. And I'm going to try to bring a more post-pandemic view. So, as we already heard a lot about before already, in-person interviews has traditionally been seen as the gold standard in survey research, and that is mainly due to the rapport that interviewers can build with respondents, and that can make them more engaged in the interview, for example. During the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of major surveys have been restricted in the way they can collect data. So a lot of major surveys opted for live video interviewing, and this allowed for a very fruitful ground to actually explore the mode and the feasibility and the data quality of the mode. And the major research findings have been that evidence showed that it was relatively limited uptake, especially in comparison to in-person interviews. Those participants that did choose video interviewing seemed to have different characteristics to those that choose in-person interviews. For example, as we also heard before, they're higher educated usually and tend to be a bit younger. However, as we've learned from Mark before, the data quality is broadly comparable between the two modes. However, as I mentioned, most of the evidence has been conducted during the pandemic, and that's very useful, but it's also very interesting to explore whether these patterns persist beyond the pandemic, because as you can imagine, within the pandemic, there were extremely different external circumstances than normal fieldwork. The European Social Survey is actually the perfect data to figure this question out. For those of you who are not familiar with the ESS, it's a cross-national probability survey, and it has traditionally relied on in-person interviews. However, in ESS round 10 was the first time when video interviewing was introduced because of the restrictions that were faced because of the pandemic, and it was introduced as a complementary mode to in-person interviews. Interestingly, the first round after the pandemic still continued to use video interviewing as a complementary mode after the restrictions were already ended, and this allows us to explore this interesting question of whether the findings replicate under more normal fieldwork conditions. The research questions that we asked ourselves mainly mirror the findings that were found during the pandemic, so we were interested in the prevalence of how widely video interviewing is used across countries in the post-pandemic sample. We were interested in the sample composition. So will video interviewing continue to attract a different type of respondent? And we were interested in the data quality of how comparable it is to in-person interviews. And because we have these two data points from the pandemic and post-pandemic, we're also able to compare the two ESS rounds. So for the measures for the prevalence, we looked into all of the countries that offered video interviewing, and we were very interested in a cross-national comparison, so which countries would have higher uptake of video interviews. Then we looked into the sample composition, and for this we started looking only at the countries with higher uptake of video interviewing. And we looked into variables that were found to be significant in pandemic research. Then for the data quality indicators, we also continued looking only into the countries that had the highest uptake of video interviews. And we looked at, first we looked at interview assessment of respondent behavior. So after the interview is conducted, interviewers answer questions in a survey about the respondent behavior, and that can include questions such as, did the respondent understand the questions? Did you feel like the respondent answered to the best of their ability? And that can give a good indication of respondent behavior in the interview, a sense of the interview. Then we also looked into interview duration. And then lastly, we looked into satisficing indicators, and specifically we looked at item non-response and straight lining. And for the satisficing indicators, we looked at the 21-item Schwarz human values scale, and that's mainly because it comes relatively late in the questionnaire, and that's when respondents are typically most likely to engage in satisficing behaviors. Looking at the results for prevalence, in total 10 countries offered video interviewing in ESS round 11. And as you can see here, the highest uptake is in the Nordic countries, with, for example, Norway completing almost half of their interviews via video. I also included the UK here as an example of a country that unfortunately did not end up having a lot of video interviews. But as you can also see, all other countries had uptake of less than 5% of video interviews. We were very interested in exploring contextual factors that the countries have in common that have the highest uptake of video interviews. And we found two interesting contextual factors that all of the countries share. And the first one is that all of them were able to establish first contact with participants via phone. So in most countries, the interviewers attempt first contact in person. And then at that point, when the contact in person is established, then the interviewer can mention the alternative of video interviewing. However, in some countries that have named person samples containing the phone numbers, first contact can be made via telephone. And all of the countries that have a high uptake also, they all share that. The second indicator that was very interesting was how video interviewing was mentioned in the letter to participants. I actually read all of the letters that were sent to participants from the different countries, and I translated them. And I found 3 broad categories of how video interviewing was mentioned to participants. In the first category, it was not mentioned at all, even though it was offered, but it wasn't mentioned in the letter. The second one, as you can see here for the UK, video interviewing was introduced to participants as an option if in-person interviews are not possible. And then lastly, which all of the countries with the highest uptake have in common, video interviewing was mentioned according to preference. So participants should choose according to their preference which mode they prefer. Looking into the results for sample composition, now we're starting to only look at the countries with the highest uptake of video interviews. The results largely mirror findings that were found in the pandemic. Video interviews seem to have attracted a respondent that is younger on average, highly educated and working, and more likely to come from a larger household size in comparison to in-person interviews. We were also very interested to see whether the video interview sample has changed from the pandemic to a post-pandemic sample. Because after the pandemic restrictions were lifted, maybe participants felt more able to choose freely their mode of preference. So here we look at ESS 10, which is the pandemic sample, and ESS 11, and we specifically look at the video interview sample composition. And we see that on average, after the pandemic restrictions are lifted, the mean age has increased slightly, and it looks as though the education bias has increased even further. The results regarding data quality overall, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to go into depth, but overall video interviews produce data quality comparable to in-person interviews. Because quality indicators may vary systematically with respondent characteristics, we restricted the sample to respondents with comparable profiles across modes, specifically on these characteristics. A very quick summary of the findings. We found very similar interview assessment of respondents between video interview and in-person interview. We found nearly identical interview duration, and we found very low indicators of satisficing behaviors for both modes. And the results are very similar to ESS 10. And therefore, I think it can be argued that video interviewing does not seem to significantly reduce response quality. So concluding, the prevalence in the ESS has varied largely across country. The highest uptake was found in the Nordic countries. All of the other countries, unfortunately, had very low uptake, including the UK. The selectivity of the mode persists. Video interviewing continues to attract a younger, working, and highly educated respondent, and the education bias seems to have increased even further. Then for data quality, there shouldn't be big concerns about video interviewing reducing data quality. For implications for survey design, video interviewing can be integrated into mixed mode surveys. However, it is very important to keep in mind that the uptake remains rather limited and still very selective. Video interviews should therefore be viewed as a supplement rather than a replacement for in-person interviews. And key operational lessons, if I were to start using video interviews now, I think I would try to ensure remote contact with participants is possible and have a very clear communication of the video interview option, especially if participants might be used to conducting the interview in person. But overall, I think it can be argued that video interviewing represents a methodologically viable but selective mode in post-pandemic fieldwork. And thank you. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Great, thanks, Helena. Yeah,
sharing.
so thank you. So yeah, we've got a few minutes for questions before we have a short break. So if anyone does have any questions, please type them into the chat. You can also raise your hand and speak as well. So either way is fine. Just wait a moment to see if anything comes in. Okay, last chance for any questions. Okay, here's one. In terms of operational costs, how much cheaper was it to run CAVI, so the video interviews, instead of CAPI? I mean, we don't have that data to hand here, and kind of hard to separate out actually as well because of the way some of the countries managed it. So yeah, we can't sort of answer that question. I mean, I think sort of anecdotally and discussion we've had before, it can be a fair bit cheaper, but the problem is often that in a lot of the countries on ESS and elsewhere, you still need to visit the addresses. So I think that's why it works particularly well in the Nordic countries, because they can often make first contact by telephone, and therefore, line up a video interview without needing to visit the address. Whereas in lots of other countries, such as the UK, you need to make first contact in person at the address, and then you're already paying for the interview fees to do that. And it's, the financial gains from switching to video at that point are obviously smaller. Okay. Any other questions before we break? All right, we'll break there. So we've got a very short break, 5 minutes. Well, 6 minutes now, because we're breaking 1 minute early. So we'll pick up for the next presentations at 5 minutes past the hour, whichever hour it is where you are. So we'll see you in a few minutes.
Okay, well, it's 5 past, so I think we'll get started again. For our next presentation, we have Andrew Hupp, who is going to be talking to us about efforts and costs of conducting video interviews. So, Andrew, over to you.
All right, do you see my slides?
Yep, all good.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about costs, which was it was kind of nice that the last question was about cost. I'm not going to talk about dollars and cents cost. I'm going to talk about cost in kind of an abstract way about trips and effort. So as you could plug it into your own organization's infrastructure and not just go, oh, a video interview in the U.S. costs $1,000 less, because I don't know what that amount is. But so, okay, thank you. So first, I'd like to thank the American National Election Study and the National Science Foundation for funding the ANES and for funding a project I worked on with Fred Conrad and Michael Schober, both of which I will be using in today's project or in today's discussion, and also Fred Conrad and Lauren Guggenheim. And Fred in particular, I cannot tell you how many hours Fred and I have talked about video interviews in general. So I really value that those discussions we've had and have led to a lot of this work. So the interest in live video interviewing has been, I think, partly motivated by the possibility of reducing costs relative to in-person interviews, while retaining some of the benefits of the in-person data collection that we've heard about previously this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. So this leads to the question, does live video interviewing reduce costs relative to in-person interviewing? So today I'll be focusing on variable costs, specifically those around recruitment, interviewer effort, and travel and trips. I've included kind of a broader range of cost to kind of account for different things, but I'll be focusing on the variable cost for the remainder of the presentation. So live video interviews have largely been using the meeting model, which means appointments are critical for video interviews in a way that they aren't in other modes. To participate in a live video interview, a sample member is generally invited via another mode, although there are video platforms like FaceTime where an invitation call could be made. Unsolicited contact, like inviting a household member via an address-based sample for a first video interview, at the moment is unlikely to be productive. Video interviews may be a better fit for studies that collect data from the same respondents on multiple occasions, such as multi-wave studies or longitudinal panel studies in which trust with the survey organization has already been established during an earlier in-person visit. There are two scheduling models. Appointments can either be self-scheduled by the sample member or scheduled by the interviewer or the survey organization. We don't know if one model is better than the other. Both have their pros and cons. Assuming a sample member schedules an interview, then there's another obstacle to beginning data collection. That is, the sample member must show up. And there's little published research on the extent to which survey appointments are kept kind of broadly, but a good proxy is the extensive research carried out related to medical appointments. So a key takeaway from that literature is that as more effort is required to keep an appointment, the rate of broken appointments increases, and patients that are reminded are more likely to keep their appointment. Presumably the amount of effort required to show up and whether or not one remembers they have scheduled an appointment for a survey interview both affect the show rate in much the same way for surveys. So it seems likely that there could be substantial loss between invitation and scheduling. In addition to finding the live video interviewing potentially more intrusive or unsettling than an in-person or telephone interview, as one could imagine it might be perceived by a potential respondent. The extra effort required to schedule an appointment may be a substantial deterrent to participation. As the medical literature makes clear, not everyone who schedules an appointment actually shows up, even when one's health is involved, which is presumably more motivating than the promise of having one's voice heard in a survey. So of those who do show up for their appointment, a subset of them may not start the interview because, especially in the video setting, for example, because they have technical problems, like they've shown up and they have technical troubles getting the meeting started, which prevents them from going forward, obviously. And for those who show up and start the interview, some may break off, perhaps the questions become too personal. Thus, the proportion of invited sample members who complete the data collection process may be smaller in the modes that do not require scheduling and showing up, as these are decision points at which sample members may choose not to participate. So this table here consists of live video non-response data using the framework from the previous slide. In the second column, we see that only about 10% scheduled an appointment here, half of which of those people showed up, and over 90% of those who showed up actually completed the interview. So that number is pretty good, I think we would agree. And that was from a paper that we have forthcoming that was from the 2019 Conrad et al. Study. There's an MDA paper if you want to read more about it. The second column, even the third column, excuse me, is a study we did for the 2023 ANES pretest. And here we see about half the people scheduled an appointment. Half of those showed up, and everyone that showed up did it. And in the third example, in the final column here, we see that about 2/3 scheduled an appointment. About 58% of those showed up for their appointment, and initially 2/3 completed their interview when they showed up, but eventually 97% of those people showed up. One important thing to note, so these studies are all different, and their designs are clearly not identical. So the 2019 Conrad study, just for some context, was with 2 non-probability panels. It was the video interview was the only interview being asked to be done, and the respondents self-scheduled their appointment. In the 2023 ANES pretest, it was an ABS convenience sample, and by that I mean we had interviewers in certain areas for the pretest, and then we did an ABS design based on where those interviewers lived. The video interview was a follow-up interview, so the first interview was done in person. The follow-up was a video interview, and the interviewers scheduled that second interview at the conclusion of the first interview, which was done in person. And then the 2024 ANES was an ABS design, where the video interview was also a follow-up interview, and the interviewer scheduled with the respondent at the end of the first interview. And there was a more rigorous reminder strategy, which I'll get into in a second for that follow-up study. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the American National Election Studies, because everything else after this hinges on this study, or is about this study. So the American National Election Study are a nationally representative presidential election time series. It's always had an in-person data collection component consisting of a pre- and post-election interview with the same respondents. In 2020, the pandemic necessitated that the ANES incorporate video interviewing. The 2024 design included a live video interview as part of the post-election data collection. In 2024, appointments for post-election video interviews were scheduled at the conclusion of the pre-election interview. To be offered a video interview, cases had to, 1, they had to have internet access, and 2, had to have provided a positive rating of the pre-election interview. So in the end, about 2/3 of the pre-election in-person interviews scheduled a video appointment for their post-election interview. So there was a robust reminder strategy that I mentioned earlier that used email and text messages, depending on the information provided by the respondent in the pre-election interview. Every case that scheduled received an appointment confirmation, depending on, and a calendar invite. Depending on when they completed their pre-election interview, a respondent could have received a 2-month or a 1-month reminder, if applicable. A final series of reminders were sent 1 week prior, a day before, and the morning of the scheduled appointment. We tracked cost. We used separate charge codes and separate interviewing staff to better track the cost between in-person interviews and video interviews. Interviewers scheduled in 2-hour shifts, and this was done this way given the high no-show rates that I showed you on the previous slide. Interviewers were paid for their shift even when the respondent didn't show up. And interviewers were asked to join the Zoom meeting 10 minutes prior to the scheduled time. We felt it was better to have the interviewer waiting for the respondent than the other way around. The post-election field period was concurrent for all modes, so in-person and telephone was happening concurrently on the post-election side. Cases that scheduled a video appointment and didn't show up for that appointment were held for a few days in the event that they contacted to reschedule. If they didn't reschedule, we then sent the case to the field for in-person follow-up. All the data here are observational, and it wasn't done in an experimental manner. And we're still conducting analyses. We're actually working on a paper that will have a lot more detail than what are in these slides. So looking at the top table, we see that effort expended by the interviewer on cases whose initial mode assignment and the completion mode matched. So we see that the video interviews on average take a little over 2 attempts to complete, while the in-person took about 5 in-person attempts. There were 5 attempts for in-person interviews, and then over 8 for telephone interviews. One might think that the video cases were easier because of some of the things I mentioned earlier. So as they completed a pre-election interview, but all cases in this scenario completed a pre-election interview. And 2, they had to provide a favorable rating of the survey. So we looked at the number of pre-election attempts to see if there were any differences in effort put forth pre-election. That's kind of a proxy for how easy or not you were during pre-election. And it turns out that the effort for the pre-election interview really wasn't much different than was in line with the other 2 modes from pre-election. So I don't think we were cherry picking cases in a sense. Looking at hours per interview on completed interviews, we see that the interviews are over 30 minutes faster. This is a little curious because 1, there weren't any substantive instrument differences between the modes, and 2, as I mentioned earlier, interviewers were instructed to join the calls at least 10 minutes prior to the scheduled appointment time. And then when we look at the overall HPI differences, we see that video cases only take about half of the effort in the end that non-video cases do. I mean, this is primarily largely driven by effort and travel time on the in-person cases. So this table on the left shows the post-election makeup of the 235 sample areas on the study. There are 46 all video areas where the initial mode assignment is video. There are 168 mixed areas where there are both video and non-video lines, and then there's 21 areas that had no video lines in them post-election. There are 18 total areas in which all of the post-election interviews were completed via video. There's 15 from the all video group, 2 from the mixed group, and 1 from the no video group. So 33% of all video areas and 8% of all areas overall had all of their interviews in those areas done via video. So that means we've at least presumably reduced some travel. So of these 18 segments where all of the completed interviews were via video, half of them had no trips and they ended up with no non-responding lines. One had a trip, one had 1 trip and 1 non-responding line in the end. 7 had between 0 and 10 trips and 1 non-responding case, and 1 had 7 trips with 2 non-responding cases. So in the end, to try to answer this question, does live video interviewing reduce costs relative to in-person interviewing? I think the answer is yes, but maybe not as much as some had hoped, right? Like, I think there were grandiose ideas that this was going to cut, millions of dollars and all in-person work could shift to video. That's not the case. Savings realized are heavily design dependent. So NES has kind of some critical design constraints that they can't really work around that might make ANES more efficient, but like having a sequential design rather than a concurrent design where you would say, let's try all the video interviews first and then send the non-responding cases to the field, rather than kind of working in the field concurrently where maybe it makes the interviewer less efficient because we haven't given them all the cases, and you could have a situation where you've finished all of your in-person cases and then we come back and say, oh, here's some video cases. So in some way it could increase costs if you're not careful about your design. Scheduling and getting sample members to show up for their appointment is a challenge. Are there things that we can do differently to improve those rates, thus reducing costs, because then we spend a lot of time for these people that don't show up trying to get them to do it. Interviews completed via video take less effort than videos than interviews by in person or phone. We did see some trip savings in particular segments where trips were eliminated completely or at least dampened because most of the interviews were done via video. And any savings might not actually reduce your budget, but maybe would give you the leeway to reinvest those costs in adaptive design to do more, to go after target cases that are harder to get to. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Andrew.
Yep.
We've got time just for one or two questions if anyone would like to ask something. Anyone? All right, well, maybe we'll come back to the, oh, hello, there is a question that's just arrived. How many reminders were sent out?
It really varied across cases, right? So it depended on when you finished your pre-election interview. So we started data collection in August. And so if you did your pre-election interview in August and scheduled a post-election interview in either November, December, you could have gotten a reminder in September, one in October, one in November if your appointment was in December. And then there was the week before, the day before, the morning of the original appointment kind of confirmation. And so you could have up to 8. For some people, that could have been a lot fewer if you did your survey in October and came back and scheduled an early appointment in November, right? You had your you might have had 5, maybe. You would have had your appointment confirmation, your calendar, and then the week of you wouldn't have had the 2-month, 1-month reminders. We were trying to strike a happy place where we weren't badgering them with reminders, but we didn't want them to forget about something that was, potentially several months off in the future. Like in a longitudinal study, I don't think you would remind them every month if their interview was next year. You would do something probably closer to when the appointment was.
Great, thank you. There are a couple more questions, but we're running short of time. Maybe we could just squeeze the first one in. So were there any differences between who showed up for their scheduled video interview and those that didn't? And then did you have any information about the initial sample that would help to understand the differences? If you could answer that fairly briefly, please.
Yes. So in the ANES, we do have that information, right? That's what we're looking at. We're looking at subgroups to see what types of people scheduled, what types of people didn't schedule, what types of people showed up, what types didn't of those who did schedule. So we have a lot of information from the pre-election interview that we can look at post-election to kind of figure out if we could do a better job of targeting specific subgroups.
Great, thank you. Yep. Julia, perhaps we'll come back to your question in the final discussion section because we need to make sure there's time for your presentation now. So Julia is going to be talking to us about using video interviewing in mixed mode panel survey. So over to you, Julia.
Yes, thank you very much. That's what I'm going to do. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can, yes.
Great, thank you very much. So yeah, hello, and first of all, thank you very much again for the very interesting input and also for having me. And I'm happy to present our Calvi project, computer-assisted live video interviews from Germany, which is joint work with Carina Kolnesse from GESIS and Markus Kacker and Sabine Zinn from the DIW in Berlin. So our project is conducted at the German Socioeconomic Panel in collaboration with GESIS, and we receive funding from the DFG's New Data Spaces project. Okay, so let's get right into it, and I'm going to speak about computer-assisted live video interviews in mixed mode panel surveys and their selective feasibility and data quality trade-offs. And I'm going to save the time from the introduction, and we'll get right into the way we implemented Calvi and where we implemented it. So we used as the databases the 2024 data collection wave of the ZUP innovation sample. This is a general population household panel, and it runs from 2011 with annual data collection waves. And to measure all the effects that come with such an implementation of an innovative survey mode, we implemented it using an experimental design. And traditionally, data is collected in CAPI or CAVI. So just keep in your mind that there are two different streams, and some people have a CAPI background and are in the panel for a longer time. And some people are relatively new. It's only their second data collection wave, and they have been recruited in CAVI. Yes, so half of each, or a bit more in the for the CAVI cases, we allocated into their survey mode. They are used from the previous year. And to prevent attrition, the CAPI households are also allowed to switch into CAVI. And what we did now is to allocate the other households into the Calvi mode and to invite them to participate using a computer-assisted live video interview. And in case they wouldn't respond, they were also invited again and again and again in their traditional modes, or yes, then in CAVI in the end. So here are some technical aspects to start with. So most of the interviews were conducted from home offices of the interviewers, and there were some reports of technical problems. These were mainly related to the poor internet connectivity that is sadly still a thing in Germany. So 22% of the interviews had some technical problems, and in 3 cases, these strongly impacted the interview. But this happened mostly if interviewers were in home office. So the problems happened when the interviewers did their work from the home offices. We also had some device switches, always into the direction of a larger screen. Some of the participants used a headset, and most of them had their cameras turned on 30 and 93%. And when we asked them to consent to being recorded, only 12 out of 159 participants refused this consent. Okay, let's get into the results. First, concerning who participates. And we received a total valid realization share of 63.5% of the households we had invited. And as you can see in this beautiful plot, there are significant differences in the probability to participate for both conditions. So it's always for, can you see my mouse? I don't know. So if you are have been used to CAVI and you are now being invited in CALVI, the probability to participate is a lot lower than if you have been always interviewed in CAPI and are now invited in CALVI. That may have the background of the longer panel tradition and more trust and so on, that was already mentioned. So what you have to keep in mind is that due to the experimental design, the allocated mode is not the mode the participants realize their interview. So in the end, we only had 314 CALVI invited households. Overall 388 CALVIs were conducted. So from now on, the mode I'm talking of will not be the allocated mode, but the realized mode. for the other data quality indicators, and to disentangle these self-selection effects from the real mode effects, I raked the CAPI and CAVI samples on a large variety of variables indicators towards the sociodemographical indicators of the CALVI sample, as this is the smallest sample. So we see the mode effects in the following for the data quality indicators. And first of all, I took a look at the household completeness, which is the percentage of eligible household members who in fact indeed participated in the survey, and we find nothing. There's no significant difference between the realization modes. Then concerning item non-response, so the percentage of displayed survey questions that were skipped by respondent, so it's not on household level anymore, but on respondent level, is item non-response. And as we only have a very little number of break-offs, this wouldn't make a very good own variable. So I weighted the item non-response indicators up. So I weighted them higher by break-off position. So there was a stronger penalization for earlier break-offs. And we can see here, quite surprisingly, as I think, so, but also we heard this before, I remember, that there are significant differences in favor of CALVI, but the effect sizes are just very tiny. Concerning speeding is in this particular survey, I did the definition of the percentage of survey instruments respondent speeded through with completing faster than 40% of the median completion time for respondents using in the same survey mode. And here we see that CALVI participants speed significantly lower versus CAPI and CAVI participants, which is also quite interesting and obviously has to do with the interviewer interaction somehow in the CAPI household maybe. Then I took a look at non-differentiation, which is the individual average non-differentiation as measured by the mean root of pairs over all item batteries in the survey. And here we see that all these modes differ significantly from each other, also with CALVI having the least non-differentiation tendencies. So then I took a look at sensitive questions and I found the question for the political party preference, but there was only very little non-response. So I took a look at the following questions for the strength of their preference once they had named a political party. And then I took a look at how often people use the middle category, like so, not so much. Okay, and I found nothing. So there's not a particular hint on social desirability here, maybe. And then I took a look at heaping. So I defined it as the share of household members' responses rounded to the nearest 100 across all valid numerical answers to open-ended monetary questions such as rent, utilities, garbage collection, etc. And again, there was no significant difference between the modes. And finally, I was interested in who agrees to have their data linked with administrative records from the IAB, the Institute of Employment Research in Germany. And here we find that CALVI participants are very open to have their data linked, and there's no significant difference between CAVI and CAPI users, interestingly. So now the selectivity, I think here is a set of sociodemographic variables. We find no effects for migration or gender, but So households with kids are overall likely to participate, but particularly in Calvi. And concerning the age, Calvi is interesting for the youngest group, and Calvi seems to be less interesting for the eldest. Then we have no effects for the medium income category, but Calvi seems to be particularly interesting for participants with a higher income who are full or part-time employed and have a high formal level of education. And Calvi is not so interesting for people with a lower socioeconomic status, maybe. Then here are some infrastructure indicators, and we see that yes, infrastructure helps, and internet. Very good internet access. Infrastructure improves the participation of Calvi participants, and it's quite a bit difficult in rural areas in Germany, even more for the eastern part of the country. And just briefly, so concerning the technical literacy, Calvi seems to be particularly interesting for daily internet users and regular video meeting users. And it's not so appealing to people who are not so much used to it. We find Calvi users to be overall satisfied with the mode, but not so much as the users of the other modes. Sorry, I'm running a bit. And when asked for their hypothetical choice of their future mode, Calvi and Calvi participants tend to prefer the mode they had participated in, which is definitely more ambivalent among Calvi users. So that's not such a clear decision. Here are some conclusions. So it seems to require a lot of motivation to participate in Calvi, to book an appointment and so on. For the very high level of motivation needed, the participation rates were surprisingly high. Still, we lost several panel cases, which is of course not what we aim to in a panel. So soft switch should always be made possible to minimize attrition. Calvi still addresses a certain subpopulation, as we already heard before. Calvis deliver high quality data, and Calvi participants are considerably open to consent to data linkage. There are still technical issues, and the internet connectivity plays a role, and satisfaction with Calvi is okayish, but it's not the first choice for the majority of participants. And yeah, that was my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you, Julia. Does anyone have any questions? Gabby.
Sorry, I didn't actually have a question to this particular presentation. I wanted to refer to something in the chat, but I think that should be later. Sorry.
Ah, okay. All right. Well, I'll ask a question if I may, while anyone else might be thinking of questions to ask. I was wondering about the, so you had in your panel study, you had a group of participants who were used to participating online, which you then subsequently invited to take part via video. I was wondering what the kind of motivation was for doing that, because I mean, most of the applications of video that we've been talking about today have involved studies which have typically been conducted face-to-face, trialing video, either because doing in-person interviewing was unfeasible during the pandemic, or we've talked about how there could be a cost saving, but it would obviously cost more to do video interviewing rather than web-based interviewing. So I was wondering what the motivation was for that switch.
So immediately, I totally agree with you that Calvis are, of course, more expensive than Calvis. And if people are already used to Calvi, why not let them Calvi on? But on the long run, I think it would have been interesting to learn whether maybe this personal interaction, even if it's online and thereby cheaper than copies, may lead to a higher level of data quality and may increase retention and serve retention, and thereby on the long run save costs again. So
yeah. Okay, thank you. That makes sense. I guess, yeah, as a follow-up to that, which is kind of straying into the discussion that we might have in a moment about the future of video interviewing, in light of, I was just also wondering, in light of what you found with the web participants, the prior web participants being less likely to take part when invited to take part by video, what your plans were going forward. Will you be continuing to encourage these participants to take part by video, or will you be returning to the web?
So the project has some more crazy ideas of target the mode allocation for the next wave and so on. And yeah, we would have mixed everything wildly. But from a panel management perspective, it just costs too many cases, and that's why we at this point will not continue to conduct Calvi. So we cannot have this look on the long-term effects, unfortunately.
Interesting. Thank you. Right. So on with that, I think Tim, you could come back on. Tim's going to chair a discussion now about the potential future for video interviewing, where we really hope to get your thoughts on this. You're muted, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I need to learn to use this video technology. Yeah, thanks, Matt, and all the presenters as well. Yeah, I think it's a really nice set of presentations with different perspectives on video interviewing, and there's definitely themes that emerge looking across them. I think that, I mean, maybe not the most surprising thing, but it seems that once you get people on the video interview and you kind of start the interview, the process is pretty good. Like, you know, people tend to get through them. Data quality seems to be quite good. Measurement comparison, certainly with in person, seem quite stable. But it's kind of getting to that point in the first place that's often more challenging. So we've sort of heard about the challenges of recruitment, and in different contexts as well. So depending on, you know, what sample frame you've got, how you can make contact, the nature of the study. And obviously Andrew talked a lot about scheduling and the challenges of that you know, you can't contact a person in the way that you administer the interview. There's that disconnect there that, you know, is a barrier, I think, at the moment. But I think, you know, that's obviously one theme, but I think more broadly, I think we've got a pretty good picture of where we are with video interviewing now, with all these different perspectives. But what we wanted to finish with was a bit of a reflection really on maybe where it goes next. You know, what's the future potential, and that could be future potential in terms of live video interviewing, as we sort of mostly heard about here, or other uses of video interviewing in the future could sort of broaden out as well. So I wanted to open up to a discussion. Just to kick off, I was going to hand over to Sam Spencer, who's at NatSen in the UK, and Sam's part of the video interviewing group on Survey Futures. And thought it'd be quite nice just to get a perspective from a research organisation in terms of what their upcoming plans are with video interviewing to kick off the discussion. So, Sam, if you can quickly come in.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, so during the COVID pandemic, NatSen used video interviewing very successfully on longitudinal studies like BCS70 and NCGS that we've talked about today, and that's often when it was used as a primary first method of data collection. It was very successful. But when we use it as a supplementary method to face-to-face interviewing, we found that take-up of video interviewing was relatively low, particularly in our cross-sectional surveys that relied on a postal address file like ESS, as we sort of touched on as well. But that being said, and because of that, sort of our use of video interviewing since the pandemic has been relatively low at NatSen. But that being said, we do feel very positively about the future of video interviewing. We do have plans to interview in the autumn on the Generation New Era study being led by Ipsos. So that will be face-to-face interviewing with an option of video interviewing, and the face-to-face interviews will be trained in video interviewing themselves. And that will be helpful for this study where we've got sort of a multiple interviews going on in the same household. So when we've made contact with one household member, then there's an option for people to do it remotely. And another thing that we're really interested in at the moment, and we're exploring in that sense, is video interviewing in terms of trying to make our research more inclusive. That grows ever more important. So primarily, if face-to-face interviewers are able to offer it, then they can include people who don't want to have an interview in their home, and or maybe for reasons of anxiety, maybe they're shielding, but then that obviously makes our research more accessible. And then also another way, and we're looking at it, is when we do have sort of a sort of central bank of specialists video interviewers who've got special skills. So it may be a way that we can offer a sort of the rapport of it, sort of a CAPI interview, but remotely in the video interview for somebody maybe in a different language, or by using British Sign Language as well. So we've got benefits there, but it might be a way where it's more cost effective to have an inclusive design and sort of include different languages and BSL as well in the interview. So that's the sort of way we're thinking of it. And then we're also thinking that as time goes on and technology develops, that it will just hopefully get easier and easier to make appointments, and some of the glitches that we see will hopefully, sort of will dissipate. And also, already we saw in the pandemic people using it so much more, but I expect people will get more familiar and more confident with it as we go forward as well.
Great, thanks, Sam. That's a really good perspective. Yeah, I mean, while other people are thinking of contributions, and please do raise your hands to speak in this section. I would just say that the sort of inclusivity, accessibility is very top of mind for the European Social Survey as well, because we're moving to self-completion data collection, so self-completion web and paper questionnaires. But within that, there is this concern about relying entirely on kind of written questionnaire content, and whether how accessible that is, and with kind of growing sort of functional illiteracy rates across Europe, and certain disabilities, and the challenges of people taking part in that way. So yeah, for our next round, we do sort of allow people to contact us if they're not able to take part, self-complete the survey, and one option is to kind of interview them by video. But maybe in the future you could even build that into the self-completion instrument, have a kind of recorded interview, or even a kind of bot sort of reading out the questions within the web questionnaire. So I think we see a bit of potential there in the future beyond the sort of live video interviewing that we see now. Okay, so do other people have thoughts on future prospects of video interviewing? Anyone want to come in? See, Karina, you've posted in the. Oh, Gabby, do you want to come in?
No, I just thought if there are no particular questions or contributions, then I could maybe refer to something that was happening sort of in the chat that I think relates to the future use as well. And I think he sort of touched on that in our work, in our research strand, but not in too much detail. So that's a question of obviously having to make appointments to be able to have these video interviews. And there's also the question of no shows. So in the past, people were very happy to turn up to appointments and be sort of reliable. People maybe didn't have quite so much on their plate and time pressures and so on, but things have changed. And I think we see that in many different areas of our lives. I mean, we can see it, for example, for training activities, or this type of workshop, for example, where we have a lot of registrations, but maybe there are some no shows. So that was discussed also in the chat. And there was an example from Joanna Henshi about no shows and about sort of 40 to 50% cancellation rates or no shows for these appointments. So that's quite high. And obviously, for every appointment, you need to have an interviewer sitting there, which probably is then idle and doesn't do anything. So the costs are actually really quite large. I guess. So that's just something to bear in mind that probably we didn't investigate in our research round in too much detail. So that could impact on the future use as well.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. I was just going to say, Karina was posted in the chat as well. So it seems to me that the benefits of video interviewing are relatively limited, especially as compared to self-completion modes. But what do you think is the potential of video interviewing for assessments and other types of survey-related tasks which require some form of proctoring? Will video be sufficient or face-to-face required? So, I mean, there have been examples, and Matt, you're aware of this, of like cognitive assessments being built into video interviews. I know there's some US examples of that as well that I've seen. I don't know, Matt, if you want to briefly talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, we did administer the cognitive assessments in BCS 70, which for multiple sweeps we've administered in-person interviews. So these are a set of assessments which were specifically designed for administration in a face-to-face setting. So we were able to implement these via video, which we would not have been able to do had we switched to a self-completion mode like web. And we would not have been able to implement these assessments by telephone either. So completion rates were very high via video, but as I showed in my presentation, we did find evidence of some measurement differences between video and in person. They were significant, but if we were to look at the effect sizes, which I didn't present, the differences were not that great. And when you compare the size of that measurement difference to the evidence, not from our studies, but from other studies which have looked at mode differences in cognition tests between like web and in person, the kind of scale of the differences that we were seeing were much, much smaller. Data linkage consents is another complex task which was touched upon in our studies. We've always found that data linkage consents, which is a really important aspect of many studies, consent rates via web, we've typically found those to be like very, very significantly lower than in-person interviews, but the consent rates that we achieved via video were completely comparable with the consent rates that we achieve during in-person interviews. So I think, yeah, video interviewing for studies where, you know, administrative data linkage is like a really vital aspect, there's potentially a role there for sure.
Great, thanks, Matt. Yeah, please, if anyone else wants to speak, do raise hands. You can type in the chat as well, but nice to hear from people. Karina also asked actually in the chat, is there any experience with on-demand video interviewing? Appointments seem to be a problem. So yeah, certainly appointments are a problem. Does anyone have experience with on-demand video interviewing?
The ANES tried it in 2020. I wasn't involved with it. I don't know, Lauren, you're on. I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but I know a little bit about it, right? Like there's a cost there too, much kind of in the way Gabby said, right? You have to have some pool of people waiting around for these people to kind of pop in and do these. But ANES tried it in 2020 when they didn't do any in-person that wave. And they had kind of an elaborate setup where there was a waiting room that you went to, and it would tell you how many, like what your estimated wait time was, or if there was an interviewer available right away. I think you could kind of just go and do it. And if there was also an option to schedule an appointment at that kind of in the waiting room, and you could leave depending on what was going on. I don't think they staffed it with a ton of people because they weren't quite sure how it was going to work. But that could also be an inefficient model too, where you're sitting around waiting. I mean, I didn't talk about this, right? Like there is this idea of like, it's risky, but you could overbook video appointments like you do like airlines do seats. And if too many show up, then you deal with it and you pay them more. You do something like that, right? But you try to make sure that your interviewing staff are kept busy by overscheduling. It's a little tricky to do because as the example in the chat and the examples we have, right? Like but you might get a bunch of people to schedule, but half of them don't show up for whatever reason, kind of get, they're busy, something comes up, right? Like life happens. I wouldn't expect everyone to always show up, but like I would expect more to show up than are maybe.
Great. And yeah, on that note, Joanne Henchy, you asked a question before. I said we put twice as many appointments per week as we need. So yeah, in line with that.
But we don't ever book them at the same time. I haven't been brave enough to try with that yet. That sounds a bit scary.
Yeah. Great. Matt, were you going to comment?
I was just going to ask Andrew about future plans for ANES and whether you're continuing to make, to plan on the basis of video interviewing being a core component of your data collection plans going forward.
I think it's an open discussion. I don't think there's a hard yes or a hard no yet. Lauren's on ANES stuff. I don't know if you want to speak on behalf of the project, Lauren.
I think we don't know yet.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, I mean, some of the work we're doing now and that we're going to do is, I think, going to help inform that about, do we think we're saving money? How much might, or how much effort do we think, or how many trips do we think we've saved? And is it worth it? If it's not a huge bang for your buck, and then like we still have this appointment problem that we got to kind of figure out, and not so much getting them to schedule on the ANES, and ANES had the higher rate of the three of them showing up, right? But there's something, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to crack that nut about how we get more people to show up or not.
Just there's a bit more activity in the chat. So yeah, curious about which platforms are being used in these studies and any concerns with privacy or data security. And maybe I can talk briefly about the ESS experience. So something we thought about a lot when we first introduced video interviewing, whether we should allow, a range of platforms to be used or require a single one. What we advised is that generally countries should use Zoom or Teams because we obviously widely used and we know a lot about those platforms, but they all needed to complete in their data processing agreements with details of the platforms they were using and how they would ensure the security. But it were things like, so they would need to use a licensed version of the platform. They wouldn't require respondents to be able to sign up to the platform or kind of register in order to take part in an interview. We generally didn't record the video interviews, but I think others have as well. But yeah, it is a concern, I guess. And I think particularly if there's platforms that are less familiar, you need to spend quite a lot of time finding out about how they're going to use the data, etc. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add on platforms.
We used ANES, or on ANES, we used Zoom, and in the work with Fred and Michael, we used Blue Jeans. That was before the pandemic. And Michigan's also done, kind of to Karina's earlier question, we did a pilot on cognitive assessments where they used Zoom, but this was a little bit different model. We sent tablets out to the family. They were doing an assessment of children, and they sent out the equipment to the household that we kind of had control over in lockdown because we didn't want, and we wanted, the kid to be able to go off and have some privacy potentially too, and not have, whatever else is going on around them. So that's another model we haven't really talked about where we, control the equipment. I mean, it's, I don't want to say it's far-fetched. Like, I don't know that you would do that in a production study, like moving equipment around is a logistical challenge, but for the pilot they did where they were trying it, right? They mirrored Blaze on a Blaze instrument on the tablet, and then also used the camera on the tablet to help do the assessment.
Thanks. And yeah, I mean, I think the platform, I would recommend the Good Practice Guide that we produced as part of this the Survey Future project, which has a chapter on platforms and some concerns around that. So obviously there's kind of limitations with Zoom and Teams, and they're not designed for doing survey interviews, and depends what kind of stimulus you're sharing, and When we sort of did it on ESS initially, the interview would have like their Cappy laptop on the side, and then be sharing the show cards on as part of the Zoom interview. So they're kind of dealing with two different devices at the same time. And there are there's a platform in France that we've heard about in different conferences, I think called Cavicio, which is more sort of bespoke around survey interviewing by video interviewing, but by video. But I think I guess the challenge is to really invest in things like that. Then you need to scale and the demand for video, and it's not always been there so far. Okay, a bit more discussion on appointments in the chat as well. So I see Julie said, yeah, maybe makes sense to restrict appointments to 1 week in the future. Easy to maintain high level of motivation, etc. Seems like a good suggestion. Any final thoughts? We're basically finishing. Our time is up, but there's still maybe time for one further thought if anyone wants to say anything to finish. Okay, in that case, we'll close. Thanks a lot to all the presenters, and thanks for everyone for attending. I think it's been a really good session from our point of view. Hopefully people have enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. Obviously, the recording will be available. The presenters, I'm sure, will be happy to take questions. We do have some of us are involved in a video interviewing special interest group, which meets very occasionally, but at least once a year if we can. And in a similar way, presentations get shared there, and different people across the globe who are doing video interviewing kind of share ideas there. So if people are interested in joining that and are not members already, feel free to get in touch with me, and I can add you to the mailing list. Great. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.